guys, it's Sam, and this is my spoiler-free review of The Magicians by Lev Grossman. This is the first book in an adult fantasy trilogy, and involves our main character of Quentin, who is a sad and angry overachiever, and he is obsessed with this book series that is set in a world called Fillory. This book series is basically like a Chronicles of Narnia type series, and he's always been obsessed with these books, and one day he discovers that magic is in fact real, and he ends up going to a school for magic. Now, a lot of people make the mistake of calling this an adult Harry Potter, and that is so far from the truth. This series is definitely different from everything I've ever read in the fantasy genre, and it's a hard book to review because if you've seen my Goodreads review, it's a lower star rating, but that's not because I don't think it's a good book. It's based purely on my enjoyment level throughout most of the book, but my enjoyment level was down farther intentionally. The book does things intentionally and twists things so that the reader is most likely left kind of disconcerted and discombobulated and uneasy feeling at the end, and not necessarily like, yay, everything is great, because that's not what this book is about. So it's not like a happy story like Harry Potter and stuff. Even in Harry Potter's darkest moments, it still has that element of like happiness mixed in. And this book, while very funny and does have some good moments and stuff like that, is definitely more in the line of realistic fantasy. I'll get into this. So this entire book messes with your expectations, and I want you to keep that in mind throughout everything that I talk about with all of my usual components I talk about, because it completely messes with your expectations of what you think you're going to get out of a fantasy. I went into this book without expectations, I thought. I was like, I know that this book has really mixed reviews, I know that I'm going to read the whole series, so it doesn't matter really what I think of this, and I know that these characters are supposed to be unlikable characters. So I went in pretty much completely blank slate and didn't know much besides what I told you guys in the synopsis, and I still feel like I had expectations just based on being a fantasy reader and reading a lot of fantasy books and enjoying fantasy movies and fantasy media. Like, this takes all of that and all of the things that you think you know are going to happen, that you just expect to happen inherently, and twists them and does different things with them and just takes those tropes and talks about them, and it's cool. But it's not always an enjoyable ride. So with the world building, we actually get to see a lot of different places, and I enjoyed that. Mostly with the world building, I want to talk about the magic system in here. This magic system is a different magic system than I've ever seen. It's a complex, but not in like a Brandon Sanderson way, where you have this like really complex but explained to you magic system. Things are complex and they're explained, but they're kind of not. This is a very scholarly, almost scientific kind of magic. So you have this college where people are learning and they really have to work at it, where I feel like a lot of fantasy you just have characters who are inherently good at what they do. And basically this book is saying like all the people that went to this school are good at magic or can be good at magic. You know, they have the ability, but like you actually have to work at it, and not everyone's going to be a good magician. So the magic is different and complex, and the characters really have to work at it, and some of them work at it really hard and still aren't as good as the other ones. So there is this mix of like almost nature versus nurture going on, where I feel like a lot of fantasy books just have like the characters are just really good at this, and there's a little bit of training montages, but ultimately like anyone can kind of do it. But this book is like, no, you have to, like, there's all these elements going into it, and you have to really focus on it, and that's like a very different and cool way of looking at magic. Next I want to talk about the characters, because I feel like the characters are one of the things that was talked about most of this book, and I already mentioned it, is that these characters are generally viewed as unlikable characters, and I would agree with that. Like, I didn't really like or dislike any of the characters for the most part. There were times that I disliked some of them because they make dumb decisions, but they're realistic dumb decisions. There's nothing really out of the realm of normal, like Earth type bad decisions that they do. Like, they just make normal human mistakes, and I feel like that's a thing that a lot of people don't like about this book, is that you have these characters that you expect to be kind of likable, even if you know in your head that they're not supposed to be necessarily likable, and they're normal and they're normally flawed human beings. You expect them to be more likable because you have this setting of this like magical school in this fantasy world, and ultimately most books, even if the characters are really good, because I think most fantasy characters are awesome, it's my favorite genre, but generally speaking, they're good enough, even if they're flawed, they're good enough that you can kind of insert yourself into their position as a reader and kind of like imagine yourself in a fantasy world or at a fantasy school, because everybody wants to go to like a magical school. So to have these characters who are probably more like yourself or your friends or people in your family, and they're not necessarily good people, and they're doing bad things, and they're making normal flawed decisions, it's interesting because you end up just being like really taken aback by it whenever you're reading it, because like I said, I felt like I wasn't really pulling for any of the characters at all in the entire book, which is a really weird thing, and it was really hard for me to read it and hard for me to enjoy it and be motivated to pick it up, because I want to know what's going on, but at the same time I didn't really care a ton about them because they're just normal people, but that's intentional and that's supposed to be that way. So it's an interesting concept. And again, we have the fantasy tropes and stuff of different characters and things and different like archetypes for characters, and they're different than what you expect. And it's just a weird thing because, like I said, it's done intentionally. Everything is done intentionally with these tropes. A lot of people will complain that, oh, this book is just taking things from other books. No, it does it intentionally. Like, all of this is very intentional. It even points to things. Like, it mentions other fantasy series by name. Like, you know exactly what it's referencing. So it does it on purpose. It's not like, oh, look, I'm trying to steal it. Like, no one's gonna notice. No, it does it and points you to it and is like, look what I'm doing. And then it, like, twists stuff around on you. So it's weird. Like I said, I didn't like really any of the characters. There's one character that I liked in this whole book, and that was it. And there's, like, some side characters, but again, they're not side characters that you attach yourself to. They're, like, really likable. They're just there. It's a weird concept. Do you see how I'm still kind of struggling with this book? Because it's hard to review and recommend or not recommend because it's just written in such a different way. And lastly, I want to talk about the plot. This book is broken into 4 different parts. And the first couple of parts I felt like were slower, and it's weird with the pacing because the pacing is done in a way where some of the action, or most of the action, is glossed over and is talked about in the same type of way as, like, day-to-day activities. And the action things that you would expect to get talked about a lot are mentioned because they're still important and they're worth mentioning, but it's not gone into the way it would be in a lot of fantasy books. And there's just multiple events that you're like, man, if this was Harry Potter or if this was any other book, like, this would be potentially a whole book, at least multiple chapters, and so, an event like this will be mentioned in, like, a paragraph. And it's so weird because, again, it's taking these expectations of, like, oh wow, we're gonna hear more about this, and you're like, oh no, it's done. You know, like, it's weird. So again, it's hard to motivate to read because you're just feeling like not a lot is happening, even though a lot is happening through a lot of it. So the first 2 parts of the book, I felt like that. The third part, I felt like started to be more normal pacing, and I liked that part a lot more. And it just, again, I think that's very intentional with what's going on with the story and stuff. So it was normal pacing with that, like you would expect with a fantasy story. And that was really interesting, and I had a really good time reading that part. And then we had the 4th part, which is a smaller part, and it's the end, and it kind of goes back to that weird, slower pacing that you have with the rest of the story. So it's an interesting way, to, again, to write a book, and I think that this book, with all these elements and the way that it's taking things and twisting them around and messing with your expectations, that is why this book isn't necessarily well liked by a lot of people. Like, either you love it or you hate it, because you're not going to necessarily enjoy it while you're reading it, but I think you enjoy it more after you sit with it. And it's definitely a series that I recommend you read as a whole. Even though I haven't gotten to the other 2 books yet, I can tell even from this book that once I get to the last book, I'm going to be able to go back at things that happened here, and, like, it's all going to kind of come together. So I definitely think that this series should be reviewed and looked at as a whole. So if you don't think that you would continue past the first book, or if you're just going to be like, I'm going to read the first book and see how I like it, see if I want to continue, I don't really feel like you can do that with the series, because it should kind of be viewed as a whole series. And I've heard that from multiple people that I've talked to that have read the series and like it, is that it really should be kind of viewed as a whole series and, like, not as separate things, even though it's very hard to do. And I'm doing a review of the one book, but again, like, I can tell that's how it is. And even though, like I said, I didn't really necessarily enjoy most of this book, I think the last 100 pages or so I enjoyed. And I liked other parts of the book, but for the most part, I was left, like, not really knowing what the point was, or not really being motivated to pick it up, but I still really enjoy talking about it. I've been talking to Sana and Lindsay on Voxer, who have both read the series, and just talking about it and discussing it is really fun. So I'm really glad that Kayla and I of Bookadoodles decided to read this for a read-along that we're doing, the Magician's Read-Along. If you're not familiar, I will leave all the links for it down below. So we've been talking about the books every month. So this month was obviously the first book for June, and then July and August, and we're going to do a live show at the very end to talk about the entire series and stuff. And again, this is a good series to read as a group and to talk about and discuss, because there's going to be so many different reactions to everything, and it's really interesting. So ultimately, I gave this book 2.5 out of 5 stars based on, like, some of the enjoyment level and stuff, but I do think this is a really good book, and I do think as a whole everything will come back around and I'll really enjoy it. And I do like how it's crafted, but like I said, based on, like, enjoyment, I didn't enjoy it that much, but, like, I did. I, like, passively enjoyed it instead of actively enjoying it, if that makes sense. I'm not doing a discussion for this book because, like I said, I don't really feel like I can rate it as, like, a gush or a gripe even, because there's just so many different elements to it, and I think this series is better discussed as a whole. So I'll be doing a discussion at the very end of the series and also with the live show and stuff like that. So if you have any thoughts on this book and if you've read this book, comment down below and let me know. And also if you're interested in my thoughts as we go, I will leave the link to the Goodreads group down below, and I am typing out all my thoughts in the discussion there with all the readers that are reading along. So if you can't wait for the end thoughts and you want my like book by book thoughts, it's gonna be linked there. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye!